She said, "Let's just be friends," and I said, "Sure." What she didn't expect was that I meant it completely. Harper and I had been dating for 10 months, building what felt like something solid and lasting in Denver's quiet museum district where I worked as a curator. We'd spend evenings wandering through art galleries, her pottery-stained fingers pointing out techniques in ceramic pieces while I shared stories about the historical contexts behind ancient vessels. Our weekend camping trips to the Rocky Mountains had become our thing. She'd bring her portable pottery wheel to sketch forms inspired by the landscape while I photographed petroglyphs and read about indigenous pottery traditions. I thought we were building toward something permanent, maybe even discussing moving in together by winter. Everything felt natural and unhurried, the kind of relationship where you stop worrying about timelines because you're too busy enjoying the present. Then Caleb came back to town. Harper mentioned him casually at first, her ex-boyfriend who'd been trying to start a climbing school in Colorado Springs. "He keeps texting me," she said one evening while we arranged flowers she'd bought at the farmer's market. Apparently his business venture failed and he's back in Denver. I didn't think much of it initially. Exes reach out sometimes, especially when their lives aren't going according to plan. Harper seemed more irritated than anything else, rolling her eyes when his name appeared on her phone. "He's asking about climbing gear he thinks he left at my studio months ago," she explained, setting her phone face down on the kitchen counter. I trusted her completely. Harper worked as a freelance pottery instructor, spending most days at her ceramic studio in the Arts District, teaching classes and working on commission pieces. She'd built her reputation slowly, methodically, the same way she approached everything else in life. I admired her dedication to her craft, the way she could lose herself in clay for hours, emerging with hands covered in earth and a satisfied smile. When Caleb started showing up at the coffee shop where she taught weekend pottery workshops, Harper assured me it was just coincidence. "He's probably just getting coffee," she said when I mentioned seeing his climbing gear-loaded Jeep parked outside. "You know how small Denver's Arts District is? Everyone ends up at the same places." But I started noticing changes. Subtle at first, Harper would suddenly flip her phone face down during our conversations, or she'd seem distracted during our usual museum visits, checking her messages more frequently than usual. Our discussions about future travel plans, which had always excited her, began receiving distracted responses. "Yeah, that sounds nice," she'd say about a pottery festival in Santa Fe we'd planned to attend, but her enthusiasm felt forced. The woman who used to plan our weekend camping trips a month in advance was suddenly vague about her availability. "I might have some studio commitments," became her standard response when I suggested activities. The shift was subtle but undeniable, like watching someone slowly tune out of a conversation they used to enjoy. I caught her scrolling through Caleb's Instagram one evening while we watched a documentary about ancient Mesopotamian pottery. The screen showed him scaling red rock formations in spectacular locations, muscles defined against dramatic landscapes, his smile confident and carefree. His feed was full of adventure shots, rappelling down canyon walls, conquering technical climbing routes, posing with groups of athletic-looking students at outdoor climbing workshops. When she realized I'd seen, she quickly closed the app. "Just checking what he's up to," she said, but something in her voice had changed. The Harper I'd fallen for was thoughtful and present, someone who gave her full attention to whatever was in front of her. This new version seemed to be living partially somewhere else, her mind wandering to possibilities I couldn't compete with because I couldn't even see them clearly. I started recognizing the signs of someone mentally already halfway out the door, even while physically still sitting next to me on the couch. The breaking point arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when I decided to surprise Harper with lunch at her ceramic studio. I'd brought sandwiches from her favorite deli and was looking forward to watching her work on a new series of vases she'd been excited about. Through the large windows of her studio, I could see her animated conversation with someone whose back was turned to me. When I walked in, I found Caleb examining her pottery wheel with the focused attention of someone genuinely interested in the craft. "This is amazing craftsmanship," he was saying, running his fingers along the smooth metal surface. "I never really appreciated the technical skill involved in ceramics when we were together." Harper's face was brighter than I'd seen it in weeks, her usual reserve replaced by an energy that made her seem years younger. "Max, you remember Caleb," she said, though her tone suggested this wasn't exactly the surprise encounter she described it as. "He stopped by to pick up that climbing gear, but we got to talking about the intersection of outdoor adventure and artistic expression." What was supposed to be a 5-minute gear retrieval had clearly been going on for much longer. Caleb's climbing equipment sat untouched by the door while he and Harper stood close together, discussing her work with an intimacy that made me feel like an intruder in a space where I'd always been welcome. I noticed how Harper's body language had shifted. She was using her hands more expressively, laughing at comments that weren't particularly funny, and maintaining eye contact in a way that felt charged. "I was just telling Harper about this incredible pottery tradition I discovered while climbing in Peru," Caleb continued, completely comfortable in the space despite supposedly just stopping by. "There are these ancient techniques that indigenous climbers use to create vessels for storing water during long expeditions. I thought she might find the historical connection interesting." He spoke with the confident enthusiasm of someone who'd found his audience, and Harper was clearly captivated. I watched her nod eagerly as he described pottery techniques he'd apparently learned during his failed business venture, techniques that seemed suspiciously similar to ones we discussed during our museum visits. The conversation flowed between them with an ease that made our recent interactions feel stilted by comparison. When Harper finally remembered I was there, she introduced the lunch I'd brought as if it were an afterthought. "Oh, Max brought sandwiches," she said, but neither of them seemed interested in eating. Instead, Caleb launched into stories about his climbing expeditions, weaving in references to art and culture he'd encountered in various locations. His tales were filled with dramatic moments, getting caught in unexpected storms, discovering hidden cave paintings, helping rescue injured climbers, each story more adventurous than anything I could offer. Harper hung on every word, asking follow-up questions about techniques and locations, her pottery temporarily forgotten. I found myself standing awkwardly by her workbench, holding sandwiches that were getting cold while watching what felt like a performance designed to highlight everything exciting that was missing from our relationship. The studio, which had always felt like Harper's sanctuary, suddenly seemed to belong to someone else's conversation. "You should really consider combining your pottery with adventure travel," Caleb suggested, his hand briefly touching Harper's shoulder as he pointed to one of her pieces. "Imagine creating works inspired by remote locations, maybe even teaching pottery workshops at climbing destinations. You have the skills to create something completely unique." The idea clearly thrilled Harper in a way that our careful plans for pottery festivals and museum collaborations never had. Her eyes lit up as she began imagining the possibilities he was describing. "That sounds incredible," she said, her voice filled with a longing I recognized but had never been able to inspire. "I've always wanted to travel more, to push myself creatively in new environments." As their conversation continued, I realized I was witnessing something more significant than a casual catch-up between exes. This was Harper discovering a version of herself she'd either forgotten or never known existed, and I was clearly not part of that vision. The careful, thoughtful life we'd been building together suddenly seemed small and limiting compared to the adventures Caleb was describing. When I finally excused myself, citing work responsibilities, neither of them seemed particularly concerned about my departure. The confrontation came during what was supposed to be our romantic weekend getaway to Aspen, a trip we'd planned months earlier to celebrate the changing fall colors and visit some galleries Harper had been excited about. Instead of the peaceful retreat I'd anticipated, the 3-hour drive felt tense and awkward, filled with Harper's distracted responses to my attempts at conversation. She spent most of the journey staring out the window or checking her phone, claiming she was just thinking about some new creative directions for her work. I knew better. When we reached the scenic overlook we'd visited on our first trip together, Harper asked me to pull over. The view was spectacular, golden aspens stretching across the mountainside under a perfect blue sky, but something in her expression told me she wasn't stopping to admire the scenery. "Max, we need to talk about something important," she began, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about us, about where we're heading, and I'm feeling confused about some things." I turned off the engine and waited, already knowing where this was going but curious to hear how she'd frame it. The mountain air was crisp and clean, a stark contrast to the suffocating feeling settling in my chest. Seeing Caleb again has awakened some feelings I thought were completely buried, she continued, staring at her hands instead of meeting my eyes. I'm not saying I want to be with him, but it's made me realize that I might be settling into something comfortable instead of exploring what I really want from life. Settling. The word hit exactly as intended. Our relationship, which I'd seen as stable and purposeful, was apparently just comfortable settling to her. I think I need some space to process these emotions, she said, finally looking at me with what seemed like genuine regret. It's not fair to you for me to stay in this relationship while I'm feeling so uncertain about everything. You deserve someone who knows exactly what they want, and right now, I'm not that person. The speech felt polished, like she'd practiced it multiple times to get the tone just right, sympathetic but firm, regretful but determined. I could almost hear Caleb's influence in the phrasing about exploring what she really wanted from life and not settling for comfortable. So this is you breaking up with me, I said, keeping my voice level and calm. I guess it is, she replied, seeming almost surprised by my directness. I just need time to figure out who I am outside of this relationship, to explore possibilities I've been ignoring. Instead of the dramatic scene she'd probably anticipated, I simply nodded and started the car. Okay, I said. I appreciate your honesty. We should probably head back to Denver then. The simplicity of my response clearly caught her off guard. Her eyes widened slightly, and she opened her mouth as if to say something else, then closed it again. I could see her processing my lack of emotional reaction, the absence of pleading or arguments that she'd likely expected. That's it? She asked after a moment. You're not going to try to change my mind or ask me to reconsider? Harper, you just told me you need space to explore other possibilities. What exactly would you like me to say to that? I put the car in reverse and began backing away from the overlook. I thought you'd want to fight for us, for what we've built together. Her voice carried a note of disappointment that struck me as oddly manipulative. You don't fight for someone who's already told you they're uncertain about wanting to be with you. That's not fighting for a relationship, that's begging someone to stay who's already mentally gone. The 3-hour drive back to Denver was filled with Harper's increasingly desperate attempts to gauge my emotional state. She kept glancing at me, making comments about how well I was handling everything, asking if I was okay, suggesting we could still be friends and stay in touch. Each probe felt like she was testing whether my calm exterior was genuine or just shock that would wear off later. You're being awfully quiet, she said as we passed through the mountain towns. I'm just processing what you told me, I replied honestly. You've made your decision, and I respect it. There's not much else to discuss. By the time we reached her apartment, Harper seemed genuinely unsettled by my composed response. She lingered in the passenger seat after I'd parked, clearly wanting some kind of dramatic closure that I wasn't prepared to provide. Max, I hope you know this doesn't mean I don't care about you, she said softly. I do care about you. That's exactly why I'm letting you go find someone who appreciates what you offer instead of wasting your time trying to convince you to stay. What Harper didn't expect was how completely I would disappear from her world. Instead of hanging around our mutual social circles hoping for updates or orchestrating casual encounters, I executed a methodical withdrawal that was so thorough it bordered on surgical. The Monday after our Aspen trip, I declined 3 separate invitations to gatherings where I knew Harper would be present. When our friend Jessica texted about her monthly game night, I politely explained that I'd be busy with some new projects and wouldn't be able to make it. Same response for David's birthday party and the group's planned visit to the new contemporary art exhibit downtown. I wasn't being dramatic or making a statement, I was simply removing myself from situations that would be uncomfortable for everyone involved. Instead of wallowing in what I'd lost, I threw myself into rediscovering interests I'd neglected during our relationship. Tuesday evenings became Spanish lessons at the community college, something I'd always wanted to pursue but had put off while accommodating Harper's schedule. The instructor, Maria, was a retired professor who made learning feel like storytelling, weaving grammar lessons into tales of her travels through South America. I found myself genuinely excited about conjugating verbs and practicing pronunciation, skills that opened up possibilities for future adventures I'd never seriously considered. Weekends became dedicated to my new volunteer work with the Colorado Archaeological Society, spending Saturday mornings at excavation sites near Boulder where we carefully uncovered pottery shards and tool fragments from ancient settlements. The work was meticulous and absorbing, requiring the same attention to detail I used in my museum curation but with the added thrill of discovering artifacts that hadn't seen daylight for centuries. My hands, which used to spend weekends holding Harper's as we wandered through galleries, were now covered in Colorado soil as I brushed dirt from thousand-year-old ceramics. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was handling more pottery in my new life than I ever had while dating a pottery instructor. My absence from our usual social ecosystem was so complete that friends began asking Harper where I'd disappeared to, forcing her to admit she had no idea how I was spending my time. Jessica mentioned during one of their coffee dates that she'd invited me to several events but I'd been too busy with new projects to attend. What kind of projects? Harper had asked, clearly fishing for information. I don't know, he was pretty vague about it, Jessica reported back to me later, amused by Harper's obvious curiosity. The truth was, I was too busy building a life I actually enjoyed to spend time analyzing what had gone wrong with our relationship. When Harper sent tentative texts suggesting we meet for coffee to discuss maintaining our friendship, I responded politely but declined. I think it's better if we both focus on moving forward separately, I wrote back. I hope you find what you're looking for. Her follow-up messages became increasingly frequent and less subtle. I miss our conversations about art history, she texted one evening. Maybe we could visit that new exhibit at the Denver Art Museum together, just as friends. I didn't respond. The next week brought, I saw an article about Pueblo pottery techniques that reminded me of our discussions. Thought you might find it interesting. Again, no response. My volunteer work introduced me to people who shared my genuine interests rather than just tolerating them. There was Robert, a retired geology professor who could identify pottery origins by examining clay composition, and Linda, a former park ranger who knew more about indigenous Colorado history than most university professors. Our conversations over post-excavation coffee were intellectually stimulating in ways that made me realize how much I'd been intellectually starving during the last months with Harper. These weren't people trying to impress each other or compete for attention, they were simply passionate about uncovering and preserving history. Through our mutual friends, I heard fragments of Harper's situation with Caleb, though I never asked for details. Apparently, his grand plans for combining adventure travel with artistic instruction were more fantasy than reality. He'd moved back in with his parents while supposedly developing his next business venture, which seemed to involve a lot of social media posting about his climbing achievements but very little actual income generation. Harper had begun asking friends if they thought she'd made a mistake, if maybe she'd been too hasty in her decision about us. The reports came to me secondhand, usually through Jessica, who seemed to enjoy playing messenger. She keeps asking if you're dating anyone new, Jessica told me during a brief phone conversation. I think she's realizing that the grass isn't always greener on the other side. What I didn't tell Jessica was that I'd already met someone who made Harper's concerns about my dating life completely irrelevant. Sage appeared in my life through the archaeological volunteer group, arriving at our Saturday morning dig site with the confident stride of someone who belonged anywhere she decided to show up. She was an environmental lawyer who spent her weekdays fighting corporate polluters and her weekends exploring Colorado's ancient history with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to legal briefs. Our first conversation happened over coffee after a particularly successful excavation where we'd uncovered several intact pottery vessels from a 12th century settlement. The legal implications of artifact preservation are fascinating, she said, stirring honey into her coffee. There's this whole framework of federal and state laws protecting these sites, but enforcement is inconsistent at best. I found myself genuinely engaged in a way I hadn't experienced in months, discussing the intersection of historical preservation and environmental law while she shared stories about cases where she'd helped protect archaeological sites from development. Sage was brilliant without being pretentious, passionate about her work without being obsessive, and possessed a dry sense of humor that made even mundane details about excavation techniques entertaining. Our relationship developed organically through shared weekend trips to explore ancient Puebloan ruins throughout the Southwest. While Harper had tolerated my historical interests as quirky hobbies, Sage actively participated in planning our adventures, researching sites and suggesting routes that would maximize both our archaeological discoveries and the scenic beauty of our travels. She'd pack detailed maps and legal briefs with equal enthusiasm, turning our truck into a mobile office where we could work on her cases during long drives between dig sites. The contrast with my previous relationship was stark and liberating. When I posted photos from our trip to Mesa Verde, carefully framing shots of ancient cliff dwellings against dramatic canyon backdrops, Harper's social media surveillance became immediately obvious. She liked the post within minutes of it going live, despite supposedly being focused on her own new adventures with Caleb. The comments began appearing shortly after. "Wow, amazing photos. You always had such a great eye for capturing historical sites." Then, more desperately, "These ruins look incredible. I'd love to visit places like this someday." Each comment felt like a probe, testing whether I'd engage or acknowledge her presence in my digital life. When I didn't respond to her comments, she began liking every subsequent post I made, from photos of pottery shards we discovered to pictures of Sage examining petroglyphs at Canyon de Chelly. Her digital desperation was becoming increasingly transparent, especially when she started commenting on posts that had nothing to do with archaeology. A simple photo of the sunrise over our campsite prompted, "Beautiful morning light. Reminds me of those sunrises we used to watch together." I continued ignoring her completely, but Sage noticed the pattern. "Your ex seems very interested in your social media activity," she observed one evening as we reviewed photos from our latest expedition. "She's commented on basically every post you've made in the last month." Sage's tone was amused rather than threatened, which I appreciated. She approached Harper's obvious surveillance with the same analytical detachment she brought to her legal work. Through our mutual friends, I learned that Harper's situation with Caleb had deteriorated rapidly. His grand adventure plans had revealed themselves to be mostly social media fantasy designed to impress women rather than actual business opportunities. The climbing school venture had failed not because of location or timing, but because Caleb lacked the discipline and financial responsibility necessary to run a legitimate business. He'd been maintaining relationships with multiple women from his climbing classes, selling them the same adventure lifestyle dreams he'd used to recapture Harper's attention. When Harper discovered his deception, the confrontation had been explosive and public, taking place at the coffee shop where she taught pottery classes and providing entertainment for half the arts district. "She's been asking everyone about your new girlfriend," Jessica reported during one of our check-ins. "Apparently she's seen the photos you've been posting and wants to know how serious things are between you two." The question made me realize how completely my priorities had shifted. With Harper, I'd constantly worried about the stability of our relationship, analyzing every interaction for signs of dissatisfaction or distance. With Sage, those anxieties simply didn't exist. Our relationship felt natural and sustainable, built on genuine compatibility rather than careful management of someone else's emotional needs. "Pretty serious," I told Jessica honestly. "We're planning a trip to Chaco Canyon next month, and she's already talking about helping me apply for some graduate programs in archaeological preservation." The information would undoubtedly make its way back to Harper, but I no longer cared about managing her emotional reactions to my choices. When Sage and I attended our first public event together, a gallery opening featuring contemporary interpretations of ancient pottery techniques, Harper materialized near the wine table with the studied casualness of someone who'd definitely known we'd be there. She approached us with a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, introducing herself to Sage with exaggerated friendliness. Harper's carefully orchestrated, chance encounter at the gallery felt like watching someone execute a plan they'd rehearsed but hadn't quite perfected. She positioned herself near the pottery display where she knew I'd eventually end up, timing her approach for maximum impact when Sage stepped away to take a phone call. "Max, I'm so glad I ran into you," she said, her voice carrying that familiar tone of someone trying to sound casual while delivering a prepared speech. I've been hoping we could talk privately for a while now. I continued studying a ceramic piece that reminded me of artifacts we'd found at our recent dig sites, not giving her the immediate attention she clearly expected. I've been doing a lot of thinking since our breakup, she continued, moving closer so her voice wouldn't carry to other gallery visitors. And I've realized I made a terrible mistake. What I had with Caleb wasn't real, it was just excitement and fantasy. You and I had something genuine, something stable that I was too immature to appreciate. The confession felt scripted, like she'd practiced different versions until she found one that sounded appropriately remorseful. I finally turned to look at her, noting how different she appeared from the confident woman who'd broken up with me in Aspen. I'm sorry things didn't work out with Caleb, I said simply. But I'm not sure what you want me to say about us. I want us to try again, she said, the words rushing out like she'd been holding them back for months. I know I hurt you, and I know I don't deserve another chance, but I've learned so much about myself and what I actually want from a relationship. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd figured out she wanted exactly what I'd been offering all along, just several months too late. Harper, I appreciate you telling me this, I began, but she interrupted before I could finish. I see how happy you look in those photos you've been posting, she said, her voice cracking slightly. All those amazing places you're visiting, the way you're exploring your interests. I realize now that I was holding you back from becoming the person you were meant to be. Before I could respond, she reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, scrolling to a photo that made my stomach drop. Remember when we talked about that pottery festival in Santa Fe? I finally went last weekend, and I kept thinking about how much you would have loved it. The photo showed Harper standing next to a display of traditional Pueblo pottery, her smile genuine but somehow hollow. What struck me wasn't the pottery, it was the desperate attempt to prove she'd changed. That's great that you enjoyed it, I said, handing her phone back. But you should pursue those interests because they genuinely interest you, not because you think it's what I want to hear. Sage returned from her phone call just as Harper was building toward what seemed like a more desperate plea. The contrast between the two women was immediately apparent. Sage carried herself with quiet confidence while Harper seemed to be constantly recalibrating her approach based on my reactions. Sorry about that, Sage said, slipping her arm through mine naturally. Work emergency that couldn't wait. Harper's smile became even more strained as she took in the casual intimacy of Sage's gesture. I was just telling Max about a pottery festival I attended recently, she said weakly. Oh, how nice, Sage replied politely. Max has taught me so much about pottery traditions since we've been together. We're actually planning to visit some pottery-making communities in New Mexico next month as part of our Chaco Canyon trip. The casual mention of our upcoming plans hit Harper like a physical blow. Her composure finally cracked as she realized that all the adventures she'd dreamed of were actually happening, just with someone else. Chaco Canyon, she repeated weakly. That sounds incredible. When I finally spoke, my voice was gentle but firm. Harper, I hope you find what you're looking for, but it's not going to be with me. What we had was good for a while, but we wanted different things. You figured out what you needed, and now I have too. 6 months later, I proposed to Sage during a sunrise ceremony at the ancient ruins of Chaco Canyon, surrounded by 1,000-year-old stone structures that had witnessed countless human stories of love and loss. Sage accepted immediately, laughing through tears as she pointed out that my proposal speech had included historical references and a pottery metaphor. When I posted our engagement announcement that evening, Harper viewed the post within hours but offered no reaction, finally understanding that some choices echo across time like the ancient structures around us, permanent and irreversible.